opened the proceedings to set the ball rolling, at the heart of which is Britain's political identity as it emerged historically. And what I say there is that we see from the earliest time the idea of freedom emerging, really going back 1,000 years. The concept took root many centuries ago, and this freedom was based on the right of people to decide their own laws, to elect to Parliament their members, and to hold the government of the day to account. Now, of course, it didn't take the form we know today for some time, but that concept has been referred to by people and politicians for centuries now, and it's rooted in the heart of the British political identity. As one later Prime Minister said, freedom was Britain's birthright, and its focus and guardian was Parliament, Parliament now at Westminster. Indeed, as Tony Benn said later on, many centuries later, through Parliament we tamed kings, stopped tyrants, and prevented revolutions. Freedom was reinforced, as Chris and others will tell you today, by the constitutional separation of powers. Who, after the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, will have missed the important message that the law plays a vital role in underlining the freedom of people and freedom under the law. As that tablet says, Magna Carta is the law, let the king look out. And the king is not above the law, the executive power is not above the law. By the 19th century, we see a culture emerging which is very like ours today. We see a system of party politics, then it was Whigs and Conservatives, in which people identified with their politicians, and politicians identified with people to lead the great causes of the day. These included subjects with which we're familiar today. The mass movements for free trade, which would bring cheaper food against protection of the Corn Laws. The interest in extending the vote, so that more people would have the right to have a say in who made the law on their behalf. And we see a very lively culture even before full democracy arrived, in the form of ballads, illustrated newspapers, huge circulations, fly sheets, getting people involved. And even at the hustings of the day, you had the most lively exchanges on very complex matters of policy, and a fair bit of quipping between thousands of people who would gather at a hustings to select a candidate long before they had the vote. So Britain was unique, I think, by the 19th century in having this deep engagement of the people in their politics and the causes of the day. And the focus was Parliament, to get people into Parliament and to use Parliament to pass the laws or repeal bad laws, and to get rid of the governments when they failed. And by the 20th century, that system of government is seen by leaders and people as being creating a bulwark of freedom against the kind of excesses that happened on the continent of Europe, where totalitarian governments of the left and right removed people's freedom arbitrarily, where rioting or instability or the rule of law took over from the freedom and property rights to which people were accustomed in this country and to which they looked to Parliament and the law to protect. Indeed, I think that one of the great legacies of Parliament is the emergence of the Labour Party as a parliamentary party of government in the early 20th century to fight in Parliament for the causes of radicals and taking on the mantle of the Liberal Party, which it replaced as a party of government. So that's what we see as the picture of the past. Freedom, the role of Parliament as the guardian of that freedom in many practical ways as well. And we see today many people despair that that freedom has been eroded. We see people rather upset about the turn of events. Government of the day seems to be too powerful. It seems to snuff out the will of Parliament through patronage and power. We also see that people are dissatisfied with the fact that a lot of executive power comes from Brussels, and people have no power whatsoever over to elect those who make the laws, or to remove them, or to control bad law. However, I see in this Brexit debate a revival of the tradition of parliamentary freedom. We have seen members of parliament and members of the various political parties defy their leaders and government, and risk, in many cases, their political careers to make common cause with the British people to back a leave vote, to stand up to executive power, the government of the day, whether from Westminster or Brussels. And whatever the vote on the 23rd of June, Parliament's role as the guarantor of people's freedom will be one of the winners. And we need look no further than to the panel today, where we see some of these parliamentarians making common cause, just as parliamentarians have done, especially since the 19th century, but earlier, to make common cause with people on the things that matter most to them in the government of their country, the role of freedom in our political identity, and the role of Parliament in protecting that. So I'd like now to welcome first David Abulafia, the Cambridge historian of Mediterranean Britain and chairman of Historians for Britain, and then we'll hear from the others.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honour to be here, and of course this is a critical moment in which to discuss these issues, so inevitably the referendum will be at the heart of what I say. But I would like to recommend to you very much Sheila Lawlor's pamphlet, when it is published very soon, Ruling Passion, Parliament, the People and Britain's Political Identity, and she kindly asked me to write a short preface. And I began the preface by saying that we're hearing a lot about exports, exports of goods, exports of services. But let's think about something else that this country has exported across the world, to New Zealand, to Australia, to Canada, and that is our parliamentary system. And so I think that chimes very much with what Sheila was saying, and these issues to do with freedom and the accountability of government. So what makes Britain distinctive? In her pamphlet, Sheila Lawlor describes Parliament as the focus for Britain's liberties and people's freedom. And so this invites us to take a very long-term view. And what I want to do in the few minutes that I've got is to combine a long-term view with a much more short-term view, because my little organisation, Historians for Britain, which was founded under the umbrella of Business for Britain, has really been trying to bring a different perspective to the discussions that are going on at the moment. We are hearing quite a lot of bluster from both sides. We're hearing claims that various figures have been exaggerated by both sides and so on. And what I've been appealing for, in what I've been writing in the press and in interviews and so on, has been a return to the facts. And I think that historians are in a very good position to talk about the facts. Now, we might differ about the trajectory of English history over the last 1,000 years. And I know that at the moment I published an article in History Today a year ago in which I did talk in similar terms to Sheila about the way in which the British Constitution has evolved distinctively compared to that of Europe, the way in which our legal system, which I'll come back to, has evolved distinctively. I was then met with a barrage of, well, not all of it very polite comment from colleagues, sometimes very close colleagues, who insisted that this was all old hat, that nobody believed that anymore, that this is what historians of Britain 50 years ago used to say, but how could I, and after all my title is Professor of Mediterranean History, how could I know anything about these issues? So let's start with some of the short-term issues that we might think about from a historical perspective, and they're easily accessible. The economic performance of the European Union in the last 20, 30, 40 years. There are facts there. Has it actually really succeeded as an economic project? Well, We can look at the Eurozone, we can certainly point to that as a major problem. It's not an encouraging picture. But let's begin with the details, and then we'll draw our conclusions out of those. We can ask for information about the European system of government and the ability of the United Kingdom to secure its own decisions, to get its own way in the highest bodies of the European Union, the issue to do with the intervention by the European Court of Justice. These are historical matters. To what extent has there actually been interference in the political affairs of this country? To what extent has legislation been imposed from outside? And I think it's much more realistic to talk about these things than vague predictions. Some people arguing, of course, the economy will be in crisis, and others saying, as Roger Bootle does, he's done a pamphlet for Politeia, that things will come out quite well, certainly in the long term. So we've got those questions, and associated with questions about Britain, we've got questions that we shouldn't lose sight of in this discussion, which are questions about European identity. This concept which has been, I would say, thrust upon us by Eurocrats, not just in Brussels, I mean German school textbooks, that sort of thing, trying to create an identity, and sometimes quite honestly admitting that this is an identity which has to be created. And I think this is something that the British public has generally recoiled from. I did a piece in one of the papers the other day in which I pointed out that you walk down Piccadilly, not far from here, you will see one European flag. Where is it? On the Maltese High Commission. But let's leave it to the Maltese, but you don't even see it on a great many car number plates here, whereas in Italy you see it everywhere. So let's turn then to some of the longer term issues. What's distinctive about the political culture of the UK? Now, people have tended to try and divert historians from Britain from arguing that case by insisting, well, it's all very well to go about distinctiveness, but what about the very heavy level of engagement by Britain in the affairs of Europe in recent centuries? And sometimes this has been expressed, I think most recently, lots of letters in the Times and so on, expressing it in very sort of airy-fairy terms of, we love the Europeans, how can we live without the Europeans, and so on. That doesn't seem to be a very sound political argument, after all. Mr. Cameron pointed to Britain's engagement with the continent, mentioning the battles of Blenheim, Trafalgar and Waterloo. Not the most promising examples of British intervention in the continent, given that he's also arguing that the EU has helped to restrain warfare in Europe. So it's true, as Sheila said, it's true that this is a country which has experienced few revolutions. There was, of course, a major disruption in the 17th century, the English Civil War, but there was also a solution which was found towards the end of the 17th century in the Act of Settlement. And it's also a country, as we know, in which political extremism has really played a very small role. I mean, the far left, until recently, has not played a significant role in politics in my own lifetime, and the far right has never done so. And that does separate us very much from the European countries. But the fundamental issue to me, when we're talking about the political dimensions to this debate, the fundamental issue is our legal system. And so I'm very glad that Sheila mentioned this question of law. We have a legal system, as you all know, based on common law, based on precedent. So it is a legal system based in history. And judges actually looking back to see what their predecessors have done and creatively coming up with solutions. So this idea of organic evolution over time takes one back to Edmund Burke, reflections on the French Revolution. That is the sort of system. I think he understood the temper of this nation extremely well. And it also applies, obviously, to our constitutional system. No written constitution, a House of Commons that uses, I stand to be corrected by parliamentarians, but a House of Commons that uses as its rule book Erskine May, which is basically a private endeavour, 1844, updated, but it doesn't actually have a firm constitutional status. That is how we work, and it's a very different way of working to the European Union. Countries, with the exception of Cyprus and Ireland, countries which follow the Code Napoleon, countries which are much more accepting of a regime in which directives and legislation come out of a commission which formulates the legislation, decides what the issues are, and although there's some sort of revision process, it is a very, very different way of proceeding to the way that we find in this country. And I think it really does make us stand apart. And for me, these political issues are very much at the core of the issue. So it takes us to that fundamental question about sovereignty. I know it's not a word to conjure with in the public debate. A lot of people are very puzzled. I think the Prime Minister is very puzzled about what sovereignty is. He seems to think we'll have more sovereignty if we remain in the EU. He said that once anyway. I don't think he can really believe that. But the whole question of regaining control through Parliament lies, to my mind, at the heart of this debate. Thank you very much.
Sovereignty is a word which has been bandied about, as Professor said, very much in this debate, without people, I think, really pausing to think, what does this word mean? We hear a lot of jibes about North Korea has absolute sovereignty. We're told that again and again. But I think there is a lack of understanding about what sovereignty is. And sovereignty is not power. You will hear many people who are arguing for Britain's participation continuing in the European Union to say we have more influence, we have more power, we're part of a larger bloc, therefore we have greater sovereignty. That, to my mind, is not what sovereignty is. Sovereignty is, I think, closely tied to the concepts of democracy and accountability. But if you look at it literally, the word sovereignty actually comes from the word sovereign, the king, the ruler. And the ruler's face is on the sovereign, the coinage. The authority of the ruler is embodied and symbolized by the fact that he or she has underwritten the coinage. This was once very carefully explained to me by no less a person than Jacques Delors, when he was explaining to me the political significance of the euro. That the euro was not just an economic measure, but it was also symbolic and psychological. And it was, as the professor said, part of this project of creating a sense of identity, a European identity. But it also meant Europe is the authority, and that is why they wanted the coinage. And that is what sovereignty is. But when people talk about sovereignty in a political context, what I think they actually mean is the sovereignty of Parliament. The Queen, the sovereign in Parliament, but the sovereignty of Parliament, the ultimate power of Parliament to make our laws, and our right to elect people to Parliament to make their laws. And that is what, of course, many people feel with our membership of the European Union we have lost, because we have the supremacy of European law, and we have a European Parliament, and we have the ability of European institutions to make laws directly. So, to put it at its mildest, our sovereignty has at the very least been severely compromised. People often use the phrase pooling sovereignty, but I wonder whether sovereignty really can be pooled. I can imagine that you might use the word delegate or derogate sovereignty. You could say, because Parliament can ultimately repeal the European Communities Act, which established the fact that European law is superior to British law, because Parliament passed that act and Parliament can repeal that act, you might say Parliament has merely derogated or delegated to European institutions a power that it ultimately can take back to itself. But I don't really think you can talk about pooling of sovereignty. People often in political debate, particularly people who are in favour of our membership of the European Union, talk about comparisons with NATO and say that NATO is the pooling of sovereignty. Well, even if NATO is the pooling of sovereignty, it's not in any way remotely comparable to the direct law-making powers that European institutions have. NATO can't make laws, nor can the World Trade Organization, which people say NATO and the WTO are comparable to the European Commission or the European Parliament. They're not. What we have signed up to in Europe is something quite different, something that has the ability to make laws, and that is where I think, in a sense, we feel we have lost sovereignty. Sheila, in a letter asking me to come today, has posed the question, are continental practices different, and is there a difference in continental history towards sovereignty? I think there are a number of differences. I am no historian, but forgive me for saying this. I think in continental parliaments in particular, or continental democracies, and I don't mean that the countries of Europe are less democratic than we are, but actually they have a tradition sometimes of government by regulation, government by decree. They have a more frequent use, as I judge it sometimes, of government by regulation, government by decree, something that we experience from Europe, but is rather inimical to the Westminster tradition. I think one of the problems that we have with the legitimacy of European institutions, the way Europe works, is its sheer incomprehensibility. I mean, I wonder how many people in this room could actually define for me qualified majority voting in the Council of Ministers. What is it qualified by? I mean, put up your hands if you know the two things. How many people know? If I asked how many people know their own member of the European Parliament, probably a few more people would put their hands up, but not very many more. But the sheer incomprehensibility of the European method of governing, constituting a majority, co-decision between the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. What are the 5 presidents? Who could name the 5 presidents? Could the 5 presidents name the 5 presidents? We have constructed something that is a sort of complete labyrinth, and a completely incomprehensible labyrinth. Now, I suppose what all this is about is political union. I was one of those who, although I've been what I would call broadly a Eurosceptic all my political life, I did in 1972 make my maiden speech in the House of Commons on joining the European community. I voted also yes in the, unlike Gloria sitting here, in the 1975 referendum. But I remember at the time, one of the things that worried me was one kept reading that, contrary to what the government was saying, this was not just an economic community, there were all sorts of intentions to create a European political union, a European government, a European state. And all this was sort of flatly denied at the time. And it was flatly denied, for example, that there was any likelihood that there would be a European currency. And I remember being told by my friends, not to be so anxious about this, that all this about political union was just rhetoric. But of course I was very foolish, and I should have consulted history, and I should have looked back at the writings of people like Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, the French founders of the European Union, as it has become, because they passionately believed that the nation state was irrelevant, the nation state was dangerous, the nation state had caused wars, and the nation state really needed to be abolished. And Jean Monnet in 1952 wrote a letter in which he said this: European nations should be guided towards the creation of the European state without their people understanding what is happening. Without their people understanding what is happening. This can be accomplished in successive steps, each disguised as having an economic purpose, but would eventually and irreversibly lead to a federation. Now, I think those words are very, very telling, and I've heard them echoed by other European politicians subsequently. Ironically, one person who saw through that was Clement Attlee, because America put pressure on Britain to join the European Steel and Coal Community that was the predecessor to the Common Market. And Clement Attlee, when invited to join the European Steel and Coal Community, wrote in a memo, "There's no way that Britain could accept that the most vital economic forces of this country should be handed over to an authority that is utterly undemocratic and is responsible to nobody." Well done, Clement Attlee. And sadly, his warnings and his perceptiveness were abandoned later. Now, I sort of realized that I had been misled. I remember when I became Chancellor Exchequer, and I had a meeting with my opposite number, the French finance minister, a man called Pierre Bérégovoy, a socialist, very nice man. His life ended rather tragically. But I remember I met him in New York. It was the first time I met him. And the first thing he said to me was, "I believe that my children will grow up in a United States of Europe." And that is what European politicians do want to create. And although every measure is, as in Jean Monnet's letter, justified in terms of tackling some alleged specific problem, it's not doctrinaire, it's not done for some ultimate purpose, it's done to solve a problem now. But it's all part of the process, part of the juggernaut going in one direction and one direction alone. And I believe that ultimately this creation of a European political entity, and this is the reason fundamentally why I've come round to being a strong supporter of leave, is that I believe the creation of a European political entity will in the end in disaster. And the professor, I think, touched on the reasons for that. We all have different identities. I may not sound like it, but I'm Scottish. I'm also British. I'm also from Shetland, which makes me half Norwegian. I'm also British and European, but my prime identity is British. Most people in Europe, still today, their first identity is that of their nation. Europe does not have that sense of identity. There is not in each individual a profound sense of being European in the same way there is a profound sense, I would suggest, of being German or Italian or French. This is partly to do with language, although not entirely. The Swiss, I think, are a people with a sense of identity, even though they have different languages. But there is a conflict between national identity and the European identity. And I believe that that will come to the fore in the evolution of European political institutions and will cause eventually some tensions and conflicts. And it's already done that. We've seen in Greece how the Greek people voted for what they thought was right. I'm not excusing the profligacy of previous governments in Greece, but once in a general election and once in a referendum, they rejected what the largely German-inspired medicine they were supposed to be taking, and that was just completely ignored. And I believe that we will see this again and again and again, and that is why the European political project is ultimately doomed. The word, I'm sure some of you have heard this point before, it's just my last point before I sit down. The word democracy, as you know, consists of two elements. The word demos, meaning people, and the word kratos, meaning power. In Europe we have kratos, the power at the top, very remote. But there is no European demos. There is no people. There is not that sense of identity. Although, again, as was said, there is an attempt to create it. And that, I think, is where ultimately this project cannot work and is too centralizing, too integrationist, too in denial of national identity. Now, we were told, we're reminded that Britain's always been involved in Europe and Britain's always tried to deal constructively with Europe. I believe the way to deal with Europe constructively is to save Europe from the direction in which it's going by giving it a sharp shock by voting for Britain to leave the European Union. Thank you very much.
Sheila, ladies and gentlemen, can I first of all apologise for being late? I was in our parliamentary democracy and I was making a point of order to our parliamentary democracy that this debate being initiated by the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer was not actually going to be responded to by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who wasn't even in the House to listen to the debate, because he's so busy spinning his commentary about how he's going to have what I described as a vindictive emergency budget. And I said in the House that I thought I look forward to the time when the people give me the opportunity of voting against that vindictive budget, and I hope that that's going to be very soon indeed. Talking about sovereignty, it's basically who's in charge. Are the people in charge, or is somebody else in charge? And one of my great political heroes is Nicholas Ridley. And when I had the privilege of being a junior minister in his department, we were then stationed in that very large building in Marsham Street, 18 floors it was. And as many of you will recall, Nick was a persistent smoker and defender of the freedom to smoke. And there was one day, he got in a lift, and there was a big sign up saying, "No smoking in this lift." And Nick, in a stage whisper, said, "Can somebody remind me who's in charge of this department?" and in that department, Nick was sovereign. And somebody'd forgotten about that. And as a result of that, it wasn't long before that, in fact, it was a matter of seconds before those notices were taken down. and shortly afterwards, the sports minister, who was also in that department, he was more or less effectively sacked because word had got through to Dennis Thatcher on the golf course, I think, that the department was planning to introduce controls over the advertising of tobacco products. And if any department was in charge of it, it was actually our department, the Department of the Environment, which covered sport. And this got back to the Prime Minister, who, when having a whiskey with Nick Ridley one evening, Nick was told about this, and he was absolutely seething because he was in charge of that department, and one of his ministers was doing something behind his back which was undermining what his views were on policy. So that's what sovereignty is about. It's about being in charge. And what has been really exciting in the last few weeks has been the way in which the people have been reinvigorated in our democracy. Standing at Malliford Quay or in Christchurch or in Ferndale or anywhere in my constituency or further afield, there is a new enthusiasm amongst the people to take the power which has always rested with them. And actually, that's also true within the House of Commons, because a lot of colleagues get elected to the House of Commons and they forget that if they all come together, we can actually do whatever we want to do in terms of changing the laws of our country. And that's where the whips come in and the government comes in to try and push us in an opposite direction. And the action last night in, I think, 62 Conservative backbenchers, almost at the drop of a hat, have signed a motion saying that they will not support an emergency budget. And the leader of the opposition said today at Prime Minister's Questions that he and his party would not support an emergency budget. So in our sovereign democracy, when the people vote to leave, it will not be possible for them to be punished in the way that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer apparently want to do. That is real sovereignty. But I was asked a few other questions. I thought, just keeping my remarks very brief, I would say that one of the great things about this debate is not only the quality of the cartoons and as I say, the way in which our democracy is being revived, but organisations like the Bar Council. I'm a barrister by profession, although I haven't practiced for many years. They have done a voluminous amount of work on what all the issues engaged, and they say in the paper that they've done, sovereignty is a multifaceted concept. Well, that's getting you turned off to start off with, I think, probably. But it then goes on to say, sovereignty has a particular resonance in UK legal and political discourse because this country's internal constitutional order has traditionally recognised the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament as a body with unlimited legislative power, whose laws are not subject to challenge by any other institution such as the judiciary. And that, they then go on to say, contrasts with the constitutional position in many other countries in the European Union, and where they're subject to their own constitutions, and their parliaments are not sovereign. And when we discuss the implications of this referendum and what might happen if the people vote to remain in the European Union, and I say, well, the 60% of our laws are made in the European Union at the moment, and the European Union can change any one of those laws against our wishes, and even if all the members of the European Parliament for the United Kingdom vote in one way, we've got fewer than 10% of the votes. So that is the extent to which we've lost control over not just the lawmaking, but the ability to change the laws. And it's quite clear that even on such relatively minor things compared with World War III, the issue of whether or not we should remove VAT on women's sanitary products, even on that, we are not sovereign in our Parliament, although everybody in our Parliament thinks that we should remove that VAT charge. It can't be done unless all 27 other countries agree. And you may think it's an extraordinary commentary upon our lack of sovereignty, that when our Prime Minister had to spend time at a European summit with 27 other heads of state trying to argue just to have the permission to be able to remove VAT from these products. He didn't succeed, and there's now a provision in the finance bill going through Parliament which says that when everything is cleared, we could do that, but we can't at the moment. It is to that extent that we have lost sovereignty and control over our own lawmaking and our own destiny. And that's why these debates and discussions, which Sheila has brought us together to debate, that this is why it's so important. And whereas a few weeks ago, talking to constituents, very few of them were raising the issue of sovereignty, this has been a great education process, and a lot more people now understand what sovereignty is, how we've lost it, and how we need to get it back.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard predictions of war, plague and pestilence. Today, the Remain campaign took it extraterrestrial by talking about black holes. That is how bad it has got. And we should perhaps remember, when we hear these predictions of doom and gloom, that it is broadly the same group of people and the same organisations that predicted doom and gloom if we left the ERM, for those old enough to remember that, and doom and gloom if we didn't join the euro. Now, they were wrong then, and they are wrong now. And I would remind all of you that those organisations are broadly the same groups, including the American banks, including the IMF, including Financial Times even. I hope there's nobody here from the Financial Times, but if they are, they can stand up and contradict me. For me, the central issue, and Chris and I played a key role in pushing the government in the last Parliament for the referendum. Some of you might know that. But for us, the key issue has always been one of sovereignty. Because without control of your own affairs, then it does question the validity of the existence of Parliament itself, if we cannot actually control our own affairs. And we're often criticised, the Leave camp, because we cannot paint a picture, we cannot describe how life would be like outside the EU. Well, let me give you just a flavour, but this is based on the fact that we have control. We would, for example, have greater control over our trade, in the sense that we could, for the first time, go and forge trade deals with the faster growing elements of the global economy outside the EU to the benefit of business in Britain. That is a positive vision. We still trade with the EU, still trade with Europe rather, but the trade has continued for thousands of years and it will continue, I hope, in the future and for many thousands of years. But the bottom line is, we can paint a very positive picture. At the moment, we can't. We don't have trade deals with key emerging economies because we have to go route our trade negotiations through the EU. That is a very tortuous affair. There's 28 lots of special interests at least, and it often puts a block. I can create a picture for you where we have greater control over immigration to create a fairer immigration system, policy, if you like. At the moment, we say yes to the EU, but we say no to the rest of the world. That sends an incredibly negative message out to the rest of the world. We want a fair immigration system, one that draws on the talent of the world for the benefit of all. And yes, that will be European members, but it will also treat Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Pakistanis, whoever, fairly as well. But at the moment, we don't have that. But for me, the issue has been, as I say, sovereignty. And just to elaborate on one or two of the points very quickly, because I'm conscious lunch beckons, and I'm being the last speaker, tail-end speaker, I don't want to keep you from your lunch. But just very briefly, just to put one or two facts and figures on the table with regards to this issue of sovereignty and indeed democracy. Chris quite rightly said, more than half of our laws originate in the EU. But if I was to also suggest to you that the Brits have always approached the EU in a very conciliatory manner. We don't like falling out with people, believe it or not. There are far more belligerent nations on the continent that push their case. We don't even roll up our sleeves when it comes to lobbying for key positions. But when we have objected, when we have said we don't think that's right, when we have said that's not in our national interest, it is amazing, actually, to the extent to which we have been outvoted. When we have objected in the EU Court of Justice, we have lost 77% of the cases. When we have objected, when the UK's MEPs have voted, a majority of them have voted in a certain direction to stop regulations or laws being imposed, we have lost the vote in 85% of the cases. And then when we have actually, on the 70-odd cases, we've objected to the Council of Ministers actually putting forward initiatives, we've actually lost all of those, 100%. So this is fundamentally, for me and many others, an issue of sovereignty. It's about taking back control. It's about, yes, ensuring that we have friendly relations with Europe, but saying no, if you like, to this march towards fiscal and political union. And I suppose that is my final point. Many people think that voting out and in, the in bit, is a static option. It's not. There isn't an example in the world where you can have monetary union without fiscal union. If you've got the euro, you have to move down the road towards fiscal union, and that is going to draw you into ever closer political union. And to those who say, but we're not in the euro, I would suggest that you only have to look at the 5 Presidents' report. It makes it very clear that the institutions of the EU will be there to further the project of fiscal and political integration. They actually make the point that the EU and the euro should be harmonised more. We should be talking about it as one. So I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that on June the 23rd we put a mirror to ourselves when we vote. Do we have the confidence as a nation to actually say, yes, we do want back control, we want good relations with our European neighbours, but actually we want to take back control? Do we have the strength to withstand, to not be succumbed, if you like, to be cowed, if you like, by the bullying and the scaremongering? Lord knows now, where having, if you like, moved from Project Fear to Project Panic, where they're going to go now with regards to the next stage of their scaremongering. I come from a part of the UK, the East, where we have a proud tradition of questioning authority. I can point to Boadicea, Wat Tyler, Cromwell, and more. And certainly from our part of the world, the vote is overwhelmingly out. And I appreciate there'll be people in the audience who don't necessarily share my views, but I do firmly believe that we do put that mirror to ourselves when we vote on the 23rd of June. Do we have the confidence
to go out there and take control and actually, in my view, forge a much better future for this country. I will leave that question to you. There is no doubt in my mind that the British people will not be cowed by these threats, bullying and scaremongering. But I look forward to seeing the result one way or the other on the 24th of June. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank all the speakers very much. You've heard, I think, a very sparkling. They weren't asked to debate. They were asked to answer the question, who should rule Britain and why? And I think you've had a very full range of answers, talking about sovereignty, about whose head is on the note or the coin, and the direct relationship of that sovereign power, which is now held in Parliament. Our parliamentarians who have brought us right up to the minute with telling us how that executive that is ruling the country, as so it thinks, is going to be held to account by Parliament, including over its post-referendum budget, if it is still there to give one. I would have added. And David, you have brought us very dispassionately through so many of the themes of history. We are all in your debt. But I would say that these are very difficult questions, as our friend from the Independent asked. They are about who should rule this country. Now, that is a debate that I am afraid has not been addressed by the official machine. And you have heard today we have sought to bring some balance to a debate which has neglected a question at the heart of the referendum issue. Who rules Britain and who should rule it? And has Parliament the power to rule on behalf of the people and hold the government of the day, or the executive? 60% of our laws are now made in Brussels to account. That is a very important question, and that is why it's important that these issues should be discussed in what on earth they mean. And it's no accident, for instance, that we don't hear sovereignty being addressed by those who disagree with the view you've heard today. Now, that doesn't mean that sovereign powers can't do what they like. And it may well be that Germany and France have at last found a future for themselves by turning their back on their past, choosing as sovereign countries to do so. That may be a noble cause, and it may in their views work, but they are facing the same kind of rebellion at home, both in Germany and in France, and the recipe chosen by their leaders has not brought stability and security at home the way it was hoped by these very well-intentioned people who wanted to bury the past. I think what you learned today is there's a very vibrant past. There's not a past Britain should be ashamed of. There's a very important thing here at the heart of this debate, which is the nature of British freedom and Parliament's role in guarding it. And I suggest if we don't listen to the people here today, we're going to give it up at our peril.